Before anything else, an important clarification. No spice, herb, or food kills off an overgrowth of any specific organism in your gut in 30 days, and claims that frame things that way tend to come from marketing rather than medicine. Candida overgrowth and other specific gut microbial imbalances are things a doctor diagnoses, typically through symptom evaluation and sometimes lab testing, and they are treated with appropriate medical guidance, which may or may not involve antifungal medication depending on the specific situation. What is genuinely supported by research is something more general and, frankly, more useful long-term. Certain foods and compounds can support a healthier balance of gut bacteria overall, which is a meaningfully different claim than eliminating one specific organism, and it happens to be a claim that holds up much better under scientific scrutiny. The spice in question is oregano, specifically because of a compound it contains called carvacrol, which has been studied fairly extensively in laboratory settings for its antimicrobial properties. Oregano has a long history of traditional culinary and folk medicine use across Mediterranean cultures, often associated with digestive comfort, and modern research has gone some distance toward explaining why that traditional association might have a real biological basis, even though the specific claims made about it online frequently outpace what the actual evidence supports. To understand why this matters, it helps to understand a bit about how your gut microbiome actually works. Your digestive tract hosts trillions of bacteria, along with smaller populations of fungi, including various species of Candida, which exist in essentially everyone and are a completely normal part of a healthy gut ecosystem. Problems generally arise not from the simple presence of these organisms, but from an imbalance, when conditions in the gut shift in a way that allows certain organisms to multiply disproportionately at the expense of the beneficial bacteria that normally keep things in check. This kind of imbalance can be influenced by a number of factors, including antibiotic use, which can wipe out beneficial bacteria alongside harmful ones, a diet very high in refined sugar and processed carbohydrates, which can provide abundant fuel for certain organisms to overgrow, chronic stress, which affects gut function through the well-documented gut-brain connection, and some medical conditions and medications. Carvacrol, the primary active compound in oregano, has demonstrated antimicrobial effects against a range of bacteria and fungi in laboratory studies, meaning research conducted in petri dishes or test tubes rather than in living people. This distinction matters enormously and is worth sitting with for a moment because it is exactly the gap that gets glossed over in most sensational health content. A compound showing antimicrobial activity against an organism in a laboratory dish does not automatically mean that eating the herb containing that compound will produce the same effect inside a living human digestive system, where the compound has to survive digestion, reach the relevant part of the gut in a sufficient concentration, and do so without disrupting the beneficial bacteria you actually want to keep around. This is a pattern worth recognizing across health content generally. A great deal of impressive-sounding research on foods and compounds comes from laboratory or animal studies, which are a legitimate and necessary first step in science, but which frequently get presented online as though they already prove an effect in humans, when in reality that step going from a laboratory dish or an animal model to confirmed results in human clinical trials is where a large share of promising-looking compounds end up failing to show the same effect, or showing a much smaller one. Some research using oregano oil supplements, which deliver a much more concentrated dose of carvacrol than culinary use of the dried herb, has investigated effects on specific gut organisms in humans with promising but still limited and preliminary results, and this remains an area of ongoing research rather than settled science. What is more consistently supported across a broader range of research is carvacrol's general antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties, and oregano's potential role as what researchers sometimes call a prebiotic adjacent compound, meaning it may help create gut conditions that are somewhat more favorable to beneficial bacteria without necessarily acting as a targeted antimicrobial against any one specific organism. This is a more modest, more nuanced claim than kills Candida, but it is also one that aligns better with what gut health actually depends on, which is overall ecosystem balance, rather than eliminating any single organism from an environment where it naturally and harmlessly exists in most people. It is worth taking a moment to clarify two terms that get used loosely and often incorrectly in gut health content, because understanding the distinction makes it much easier to evaluate where something like oregano actually fits. A probiotic refers to a live microorganism that, when consumed in adequate amounts, can contribute beneficial bacteria directly to your gut, the kind of thing found in yogurt with live cultures or in dedicated probiotic supplements. A prebiotic, by contrast, refers to a compound, usually a type of fiber, that you cannot digest yourself, but that beneficial bacteria already living in your gut can use as fuel, essentially feeding the good bacteria you already have, rather than adding new ones. Oregano and its carvacrol content do not fit cleanly into either category. It is not a live organism, so it is not a probiotic, and its primary documented mechanism is more antimicrobial than fiber-based, so it does not function as a classic prebiotic either. This is part of why the research on oregano's role in gut health is genuinely more limited and more preliminary than the research on well-established prebiotics and probiotics, and why it is more accurately described as a supportive, antioxidant-rich culinary herb with some antimicrobial properties, rather than placed in the same category as foods with a much longer track record of microbiome research behind them. It is worth explaining what actually does have strong, consistent research support for supporting a healthy gut microbiome, because this context makes it much easier to see where oregano realistically fits into the picture rather than being mistaken for the main event. Dietary fiber, particularly from a wide variety of plant sources, is consistently the most well-supported factor in gut microbiome research, because fiber serves as fuel for beneficial bacteria, which ferment it into compounds called short-chain fatty acids that support gut lining health and have documented anti-inflammatory effects throughout the body. Research has specifically highlighted dietary diversity as a meaningful factor here, with studies finding that people who regularly eat a wider variety of plant foods, sometimes cited as 30 or more different plant types across a typical week, including vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, tend to have measurably more diverse gut microbiomes than people eating a narrower range of plant foods, even when total fiber intake is similar. This diversity angle is genuinely interesting and rarely discussed compared to simpler advice like eat more fiber, because it suggests that variety itself, not just quantity, has independent value for gut health. Fermented foods containing live bacterial cultures, such as plain yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut, and kimchi, have research support for modestly increasing microbial diversity when consumed regularly, and some research has additionally found associations between regular fermented food consumption and markers of reduced systemic inflammation. It is worth being specific that this applies to products containing live, active cultures, which is not automatically true of every product labeled as fermented, since some commercially produced sauerkraut and similar products are pasteurized after fermentation, a process that kills the live bacteria along with anything else. Checking for phrases like contains live cultures or finding the product in the refrigerated section rather than a shelf-stable jar is a reasonable way to identify products more likely to deliver an active bacterial dose. Reducing intake of highly refined sugar and ultra-processed food has research support for reducing conditions that favor less beneficial microbial growth, partly because diets very high in refined sugar and low in fiber have been associated in research with reduced microbial diversity and shifts toward bacterial populations associated with increased intestinal permeability and low-grade inflammation. This does not mean sugar needs to be eliminated entirely or treated as something to fear, but a pattern of regularly very high refined sugar intake alongside very low fiber intake is one of the more consistently documented dietary patterns associated with a less favorable gut microbiome profile in research, considerably more so than the presence or absence of any single antimicrobial spice. Against this backdrop, oregano and its compounds represent a smaller, supportive piece of the picture, rather than a standalone solution, much like a single vitamin would be one piece of an overall nutritional picture rather than the entire diet. Stress deserves a bit more attention here than it typically gets in conversations about gut health, because the gut-brain connection is genuinely one of the more robust and well-studied areas in this entire field. arguably with more consistent research behind it than many of the specific foods that get more attention. Chronic stress affects gut function through multiple documented pathways, including changes to gut motility, alterations in the protective mucus lining of the digestive tract, and measurable shifts in the composition of gut bacteria observed in both animal studies and human research involving people under sustained psychological stress. This means that someone dealing with chronic, unmanaged stress may see only limited benefit from dietary changes alone, including any benefit theoretically attributable to oregano if the stress itself continues unaddressed. This is not a dismissal of diet's importance, but it is a reminder that gut health sits at the intersection of several systems in the body, and a comprehensive approach that includes attention to sleep, stress management, and physical activity tends to outperform a narrow focus on any single food, however interesting that food's laboratory research might be. With that context established, here is a reasonable way to actually incorporate oregano if you want to explore this as part of a broader approach to gut health, while being clear that this is a supportive habit and not a treatment for any diagnosed condition. Fresh or dried oregano used generously in cooking is a completely reasonable starting point and carries essentially no risk for most people, since culinary amounts are well within the range of normal food use and have been consumed safely across entire cultures for centuries. A teaspoon or so of dried oregano added to sauces, roasted vegetables, soups, or dressings throughout the week is a low-risk way to incorporate the herb regularly. This amount delivers a relatively modest dose of carvacrol compared to concentrated oil preparations, but it is also the form with the longest history of safe, ordinary use and the least risk of any unwanted interaction. Concentrated oregano oil supplements, which deliver a much higher and more standardized dose of carvacrol, are a different matter and deserve more caution. These products vary considerably in concentration and quality between brands, are not regulated with the same rigor as medications, and have a more meaningful potential for side effects and interactions at higher doses, including gastrointestinal upset, and in some cases interactions with blood-thinning medications, since some research has suggested oregano oil may have mild blood-thinning properties of its own. If someone is specifically interested in trying a concentrated oregano oil supplement for a particular gut health goal, this is a conversation worth having with a doctor or registered dietitian first, both to discuss whether it is an appropriate choice given any existing medications or conditions, and to get guidance on dosing and product quality, rather than relying solely on the dosing suggestions found on a supplement label or in an online video. It is also worth mentioning who should approach oregano, particularly in concentrated supplement form, with extra caution. People with known allergies to plants in the mint family, which includes oregano, basil, sage, lavender, and several other common culinary herbs, can occasionally experience allergic reactions to oregano as well, ranging from mild oral irritation to, in rare cases, more significant allergic responses. Anyone with a known sensitivity to this plant family should be cautious about trying concentrated oregano oil for the first time and should consider discussing it with an allergist or doctor beforehand rather than testing a high dose on their own. People taking blood-thinning medications, including warfarin or other anticoagulants, should be particularly careful with concentrated oregano oil specifically, given the mild blood-thinning properties some research has associated with the compound, since combining it with prescribed anticoagulants could theoretically increase bleeding risk. Pregnant women are also generally advised to avoid concentrated oregano oil supplements, as safety data in pregnancy is limited, although ordinary culinary use of dried oregano in cooking is considered safe at typical food amounts. None of this applies to using oregano as a normal seasoning in cooking, which remains low risk for the vast majority of people. The caution applies specifically to concentrated supplement forms used at doses well beyond typical culinary use. Pairing any antimicrobial-leaning food or supplement, including oregano, with foods that actively support beneficial bacteria is a more complete approach than focusing on the antimicrobial angle alone. This might look like a Mediterranean-style meal that combines oregano-seasoned vegetables with a fiber-rich whole grain and a serving of plain yogurt, which provides fiber for beneficial bacteria to ferment alongside a small dose of live cultures rather than oregano in isolation. This kind of combined approach reflects how gut health research actually frames the goal, which is a more favorable overall balance, not the elimination of one organism through a single ingredient. It is worth pausing to ask why a claim like kills Candida overgrowth in 30 days spreads so widely in the first place, given how far it outpaces the actual evidence. Part of the answer is that gut health symptoms, things like bloating, fatigue, brain fog, and skin issues, are genuinely common, often frustrating, and frequently difficult for conventional medical evaluation to pin down to one clear cause, which leaves people searching for explanations and solutions online. A confident, specific-sounding explanation, Candida overgrowth, paired with a confident, specific-sounding solution, a particular spice, feels satisfying in a way that your symptoms have multiple possible causes and might require testing to clarify, simply does not. This does not mean every person experiencing these symptoms is wrong to feel frustrated, or that conventional medicine always gets it right quickly. It does mean that the appeal of a tidy, dramatic explanation is not the same thing as that explanation being accurate, and recognizing that gap is a genuinely useful skill when evaluating health content of any kind, not just claims about this particular spice. There are some common mistakes worth flagging here. The first is assuming any digestive symptom, including bloating, gas, fatigue, or skin issues, automatically means a Candida overgrowth requiring this kind of dietary intervention. These symptoms have many possible causes, ranging from food intolerances to irritable bowel syndrome to thyroid issues to a range of other gut conditions, and self-diagnosing based on online checklists is unreliable. A doctor can run appropriate testing if a microbial imbalance is genuinely suspected, rather than guessing based on symptoms that overlap with dozens of other conditions. The second mistake is taking high doses of concentrated oregano oil for extended periods without medical guidance, under the assumption that more is better or faster. Sustained high-dose use of strong antimicrobial compounds, even natural ones, can potentially disrupt beneficial bacteria populations as well as harmful ones, which runs counter to the actual goal of supporting a balanced microbiome. The third mistake is neglecting the foundational habits: adequate fiber, varied plant foods, regular meals, and stress management, while focusing entirely on one trendy ingredient, when the foundational habits are what the bulk of the research actually supports as having the most consistent impact on gut health over time.